Well, today I'm going to do something different. I'm going to do kind of a memorial to my paternal grandmother, and this is her. Her name is Mary Weinert, and when my oldest brother passed away a few years ago, one of my cousins asked me if I had ever read the stories that my grandmother had written, and I said no, so he emailed them to me, and apparently she had sat down and typed out on an old typewriter a memoir of her life and her coming over as a young girl from Ireland. And then she wrote a separate story, which was kind of the story of her husband, who was a professional baseball player, Lefty Philip Weinert, or Philip Lefty Weinert. I'm going to read the memoir, and just so that it's kind of out there, and instead of just having a copy that just sits here among all my other stuff. So I'm going to read it, and it'll probably be multiple videos. This will have to be serialized. But this is a story of an immigrant family in the early 20th century. So, we'll begin. Our dad, James McGuigan, came here to America as a very young man. As soon as he was eligible to do so, he became an American citizen. Studying very hard to increase his education, he became first a printer, then eventually a proofreader, a very well-respected profession in those days. In common with most Irishmen then, he didn't marry early. However, when he was introduced to a pretty young lady named Madeline McCaig, he fell in love. Many years later, when we were told the words of his proposal, we were surprised and a bit amused. Since those were the days of the Victorian era, his wording was most fitting. He told her earnestly, "I love you irrevocably." After they had been married for some years, his mother pleaded with him to come over to Ireland for a visit. She longed to see them and their little son, James. After they went to Ireland to visit her, she coaxed them to stay there until she died. Although they agreed to do this, they found that it was going to be a difficult task to save enough money to get back to America. Dad started a small printing business in Monaghan. They had to save for a long time to accumulate enough money to return here. By that time, 15 years later, they had 6 children born in Ireland. All the children were born Americans in Ireland since both parents were American. As they used to say, if a cat has kittens in the oven, that doesn't make them biscuits. The first child actually born in Ireland was our sister Madeline. She was a bright, talented girl. After saving for her first little violin, she took lessons with a teacher in Monaghan. Young as she was, 10 or so, she won a scholarship at the Dublin Conservatory of Music. Her teacher there was Professor Wilhelm, who had 2 young sons, Kurt and Eddie. Twice Madeline took me with her on the train to Dublin for her lessons. The first time I looked the place over and spotting a big bass viol, exclaimed, "Look at the big violin!" She was so annoyed at me, especially since everyone laughed, except Madeline and me. The second time she took me with her, it was to her last lesson there, since we were preparing to leave Ireland for America. The Wilhelm boys gave us each a pretty going-away gift, a gold bracelet to Madeline and a silver one to me. It's the very first jewelry we had ever owned, and we loved it so much that we gave it to our dad for safekeeping. When sometime later we asked him for the bracelets, he said he'd lost them on the trip. We were both deeply disappointed. I don't ever remember having one single piece of jewelry for many years after that fiasco. It was sad. We felt it then. A great breach of faith on Dad's part. Now I can see that it was just a tiny part of our parents' monumental task of moving back to America. It's much easier to understand the loss than to forget it. Some of my memories of Ireland are sketchy, but others are sharp and clear. That's natural, I suppose, considering I was only going on 5 when we left. Mother loved to attend the High Mass at our church, St. Macartan's Cathedral. Dad's second cousin was the bishop there at the time. I remember meeting him, Bishop Richard Owens, and kissing his ring. He resembled my dad greatly, but was thinner than Dad was then. On our walk home from Mass, we'd smell the delicious aroma of roasting beef because many families were preparing an early Sunday dinner. It smelled homey somehow, and I just loved it. How well I recall the beauty of the cathedral's stained glass windows and the incense. Even long afterwards, I thought of it as the most delightfully pungent odor in the whole world. About the house we lived in then, I can only remember it was built on a long, narrow lot. At the back of the yard were steps which led to what we called the garden. The town itself seemed not in the least extraordinary, but just walk outside of town, and walk you did because there was no other transportation then. The scenery became absolutely spectacular when it wasn't raining, and it did rain often. The grass was a beautiful green, the sky exquisitely blue, and the air soft and clean. We all led a regular life there, no food between meals, no poor English, and absolutely no slang. Mother was adamant about these things. The other children attended school, and Madeline studied the violin in addition to attending school. Since there were 5 boys and only 1 sister, me, she often took me with her, despite the fact that I sometimes embarrassed her, as I did at her first lesson in Dublin. Mother took exceptionally good care of her 2 girls. We were always neat, and our hair a shining golden brown. She had the family's picture taken several times. One photograph was especially outstanding. The 2 little boys, Gerald, 6, and John, 4 or less, looked absolutely handsome in their white-collared Buster Brown suits. Since I was only a year and a half, my brother Vincent wasn't born yet. Perhaps, and I do say perhaps, that's why this picture disappeared so mysteriously years later when all our pictures were in the care of Vincent and his wife. It would have given us much joy to be able to look back at that happy time. Fortunately, I still have the last picture Mother had taken in Ireland. It was of me alone. She dressed me very carefully, and we started walking to the photographic studio in Swan Park, Monaghan. On our way there, we passed a lovely rose garden. When we stopped to admire the lady's Killarney roses, she gave us a beautiful rose. The photographer claimed that my sleeveless, lace-trimmed white petticoat would take a prettier picture than the dress over it. He also decided to use the rose that had been given to us. So with a sleeveless petticoat, Mary Jane's shoes, white socks, and shoulder-length hair, the picture was nice and somehow timeless, with the swings in fashion. That picture looked fairly modern, more than a half-century later. The egg. Some friends of our parents had a big farm outside of town. One day they sent a pony cart to our house to take Madeline and me out to see them and to have lunch there. It was the first ride like that I'd ever had in my life, and I was overjoyed. It didn't last long, however. Shortly after our arrival there, while we were being shown around the farm, one of the sons, Charlie Rice, handed me a big white egg. I was too young to sense a trick, so when Charlie said, "Squeeze it, Mary," I obeyed. It was a raw egg, so of course it spilled all over me. Suddenly I felt horribly dirty and messy, and worst of all, like a fool. As Charlie laughed, I came close to hating him. Gone was the joy of the ride, the beauty of the countryside, and of the day in general. The new glasses. Madeline was fitted with glasses. She must have needed them to read her music more clearly. How I envied her for needing them, and how beautiful I felt she looked in them. Alas, my eyes were perfect, so I couldn't have any. However, one day, when I was in a little variety store a few blocks down the street from our house, I saw a whole lot of glasses for sale. It made no difference to me that they were just junk glasses. Wonder of wonders, the little money I had with me was just enough to buy a pair, and that's just what I did. I put them on happily and started walking uphill to our house. Horrors! Each small curb seemed a foot high, and everything was completely distorted. Mother took just one look at my glasses and removed them forever. Our neighbor. There was a nice old man who lived near us who used to pass our house nearly every day. He never failed to make a big fuss over me. One day he held out his hand full of coins, gold, silver, and pennies. He insisted that I choose any coin there. So I carefully pushed the gold and silver coins aside and chose a penny. He thought it was most amusing, but realized it was probably the only coin I was familiar with. When this neighbor learned that we were going to America, he presented me with a bank in the shape of a small green trunk. I had this bank for several years before it finally disappeared. The trip. Somehow, all the burdensome details of getting ready for the trip made no impression on my mind. I do remember looking at the moon one evening and wondering, is this the same moon shining on America too? And how is that possible? I remember too looking down at the end of our street, probably 5 or 6 blocks away, where the Diamond, the main part of the town, was located. The Salvation Army was there playing hymns enthusiastically, and I recall wondering, why are they trying to change people who are already good? Off we go. Finally, we were all ready to start on our odyssey. We went by train to Belfast and visited for a few hours Dad's only sister, Sarah Donnelly, and her family. Then we boarded a boat which was taking everyone across the Irish Sea to England. We were to go on the big ship. At Liverpool. Just after we had boarded the first boat, someone gave us children cookies. We ate them, although we knew it was against the family's rule, and we were soon very sorry. The motion of the boat in the rough Irish Sea made us terribly seasick. We were frightened and felt guiltily that we were being punished for our disobedience. But the night passed, and we were our healthy selves again in the morning. Eagerly we boarded the tug that took us to the ocean liner. This ship seemed huge and bright and clean. Being on it was a really novel experience. Madeline was asked several times to play the violin at the ship's concerts, so Mother and I went with her. I remember enjoying the big fuss that was made over me. I had lots of fun and goodies and didn't have to perform like Madeline. We all became accustomed to life on shipboard. The only real danger was when our tiny brother Vincent toddled over to the rail of the ship. Someone grabbed him and saved him from falling into the ocean. Another flaw in the trip, for me, was that one of our shipboard playmates must have been at the contagious stage of measles and infected me, although it didn't show up then naturally. The night before we were to land, there was a terrible storm. We children knew that something cataclysmic had happened when next morning no one made a move for quite a while to see that we were dressed and fed. There was a general feeling of uneasiness everywhere. When we landed, some friends of our parents, the Rices, met us. They had moved to America some years before and had become building contractors. They were now wealthy, but were kind and gracious people. They herded us all from the ship to what was probably the 3rd Avenue L to take us to their place, a huge apartment in upper New York City. Both John and I ran ahead a little, then stood waiting for the others. That's when we made the most startling discovery. All people were not the same color. No one had ever thought to tell us that some people were black, some Chinese. When we boarded the L train, I got up from my train seat and walked across the aisle to stars in amazement. I'm sorry, I misread. I got up from my train seat and walked across the aisle to stare in amazement at a Chinaman. He must have thought I looked strange too, because he stared right back. The Rices were very pleasant and hospitable. One of them, Kate, promised to buy me a pretty doll. Next day, Dad and Mother sent 3 of our boys to stay for a little while with Dad's Aunt Delia in Lambertville, New Jersey. Madeline and Dad were to stay for a few days with the Rices, but Mother took Gerald and Vincent and me to Philadelphia to see her family in Philadelphia and try to get us settled as soon as possible. Mother was a very forthright person. She looked in the Philadelphia directory to find the address of her brother, Tom, and his wife. Mother's parents were both dead. Tom's wife and mother had always been friendly, so when my aunt opened her door, there was a big surprise. Us. They were very nice, too. They had a big house and only one son, Eugene. Their other 2 children had died as babies. They made us feel very welcome. Then the blow fell. I came down with a terrible case of measles. We had to stay with them until I recovered. Fortunately, no one else caught them. When I was well, our parents rented a house, bought furniture on installments, rounded up all the family, and we started our new life. Dad got a job with the same company he'd worked for 15 years before. Finally, he changed to a job on the paper The Philadelphia Record as a proofreader. Our big brother James, nicknamed Jay, started working there too as a copy holder, which was a proofreader's assistant. Although Jay didn't get paid much, he managed to save carefully for things that interested him. That's how tragedy struck our family. Jay bought a revolver and ammunition for it, intending to practice marksmanship. When Mother asked him about the bullets, he said they were blanks. I've often wondered since if he really believed they were blanks. One day, Jay was down in our cellar with a couple of buddies shooting at a mark on the wall. But Madeline and Gerald were also in the cellar, riding on a seesaw they had made with a board over one of our trunks. Suddenly the impossible happened. No one knew how, but a bullet went wild, just missed Madeline, but hit Gerald in the temple. They rushed him to the University of Pennsylvania hospital. Either they didn't have x-ray then or were afraid to use it on his brain. They were not about to operate on such a delicate spot on this child, so they couldn't find or remove the bullet. They kept him there 6 months, telling the nurses to watch him carefully. Mother went to see him faithfully on visiting days, often taking me along. Since I was too young to see Gerald, I'd wait outside for her. As soon as she'd finished her visit, she'd get me and we'd return home. Gerald knew he was supposed to be accompanied by a nurse whenever he moved around, but one day, when he told the nurse that he had to use the bathroom, she told him to go by himself. The child obeyed her, went there alone, became dizzy, no doubt, fell, and died at his funeral in our house. I stood unobserved in the doorway to our parlor, looking at the beautiful little boy, only 8 or so. He was lying in a little white casket, dressed in a white sailor suit, which had a little wooden whistle in its pocket, after the fashion of that time. The thought came to my 5-year-old mind that it was a whistle which would never be blown. Slowly but surely our lives returned to a regular pattern. The one thing that frightened me terribly was thunder and lightning storms. I was so terrified that I'd run immediately to my father, and he would put his arms around me and soothe my fears. I often wondered why I was so frightened. Just a few years ago I read that there is something in the North Atlantic Ocean that prevents lightning storms from hitting Ireland. If this were true, it's small wonder I was afraid. One day, I was alone in the house when a terrible storm started. Nothing happened to me, and I finally overcame my fears to a great extent, thank heaven. All the children were now in school except Jay, the oldest, and Vincent, the youngest. Madeline combined music study with school. Most of us found that everything in school required a lot of adjustment on our part. I found phonics very difficult at first, so when my teacher, Miss Egan, hit me on the hand with a ruler, I was enraged, telling Mother that I was never going to school again. Mother should have done the obvious thing and explained that school was a must. Instead, she switched me over to the same place that Madeline went to, St. Francis de Sales. Now our difficulties really started. Madeline walked the nearly 3 miles without difficulty. We'd start off with just enough time for quick walking, but I was only 6 and couldn't keep up with Madeline's long strides. So every so often we'd have to stop, or at least slow down, until the pain in my side subsided. Then we'd be late, and oh, how I hated being the cause of our lateness. Schooling there was even more difficult than it had been at Hamilton. However, I did learn some recitations there which delighted Mother. These recitations served me well at assembly time, when eventually I had to return to the Hamilton school so near my home. Not only did I return, I even had the same teacher, a sort of poetic justice, and a good lesson for me. Somehow I got through the first 2 grades. When I reached the 3rd grade, the whole world opened up to me. What a wonderful teacher was Mrs. Garcia. She was only of medium height, but she had a fine posture. When we admired it, she told us it was caused by her being forced to wear a back brace when she was younger and having to do exercises to strengthen her spine. In her room, I did a complete turnaround, learning well, becoming so well adjusted from then on, all through school, I was an excellent student. One of the Rice family in New York came all the way to Philadelphia to give me the doll his sister had promised me a couple of years before. Now here was a doll, beautiful in every way. I stopped what I was doing to admire it, and I'm glad I did, for that doll didn't have long to live. A short time later, my younger brother picked up this pretty doll, too new to have a name, and with all his might he dashed it to the floor. There lay my lovely new China doll, all in pieces. I've often wondered since then, was it that I felt unworthy of something so beautiful? Because my heart didn't ache the way it did over the lost bracelet. I must say something special about our dad. He was inclined to be disinterested in styles, apparently satisfied by to be just neat, clean, and unfashionable. He was nice looking in a somber, staid, almost humorless way. Most of the time he seemed as if he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. Yet I loved him a lot, realizing that he was a good, kind person underneath his seeming ponderosity. How well I remember when I was in bed with an attack of chicken pox. I was getting better but felt lonely. Suddenly I heard Dad coming to see me and chuckled delightedly as I heard him say, I am coming, hark, the little hens are humming. I'm sorry, little bees are humming. So he said, I am coming, hark, the little bees are humming. My eyes are, I've got a fluorescent light. It's starting to wear on my eyes here. Wonderful, what a wonderful feeling it was to see that he had brought a delicious little cake for me at the bakery. It was called a Charlotte Russe, and it was a small circle of delicate sponge cake enclosing a whipped cream filling. It had a cherry on the top of it, making it look very festive. How I appreciated this gesture of loving tenderness. I'll never forget his kindness. God rest his soul. So I'm up to page 11. I'll take over from there next time. My eyes are starting to get all frazzled by this fluorescent light. So I will continue on with my grandmother's story of her immigration from Ireland to the United States in a short time. And I'm out.